So far, we've looked at some intuitive ideas about what free will is. We've looked at some philosophers' definitions of what free will is. But now I want us to think about, why does free will matter? If it turns out you didn't have free will, would that make any difference to your lives? Or would it make a massive difference? Why do people think it's so important that they have free will? Now, one of the first reasons that are often highlighted is that it would affect our conception of ourselves. So like I've said, probably all thought about times where we've acted freely or not acted freely. We've all thought about decisions that we've made and thought, yeah, that was freely done. If it turns out it wasn't, and all our decisions were unfree, they were all determined, they were all the result of causes outside of ourselves, then it seems that our conception of ourselves would be affected. We no longer see ourselves in the same way that we once did. Now, some people have also argued that this would affect meaningfulness in life. It'd be a strong claim, but some people hold that, life would be meaningless if we didn't act freely. If we were all just, robots in some sort of galactic chess game, then why does anything matter? Or why does it matter if I do this or that? It's all the result of these causes outside of me. So like, why bother? That's quite a sad view in the end, and hopefully that's not the case. But that seems to be one of the implications that lacking free will might have. If no one acts freely, then, everything's meaningless. And so related to these first two, you might think, well, free will matters because it matters that we determine how our lives and characters turn out. It really is important that, it's up to us, that we have choices over what we do and how our lives go. Like, if I turn into sort of a kind person or a grumpy person, it's important that that is somehow up to me or as the result of my decisions or choices. If it's not, then we start to feel quite powerless over the forces in the universe that seem to be controlling what we do. As I've mentioned, another reason why people think that free will matters, and this is the most common reason that philosophers discuss, is it's important to moral responsibility. And indeed, most philosophers think that acting freely and of your own free will is a necessary condition on being morally responsible. So if people are morally responsible, they have to have free will. There's no case of a morally responsible action that is not also freely willed action. And any action which is not freely willed is one that we can't hold people morally responsible for performing. That's a common view about why free will matters. And finally, what's getting more discussion these days, and perhaps something you've already thought about, is that, well, free will seems to matter for love and friendship. If we're all just sort of robots in some galactic chess game, then can we ever really love anyone? Are we ever really a good friend? If you're just determined to do what you do, to love who you love, or to like who you like, or to trust who you trust, or to, help out who you help out, are you really a good friend? Are you really in love? These are the kinds of issues that you might think are why free will matters. So that's why free will matters, but why think you have free will? Now, we've touched upon some of these issues already, but it's worth going into a bit more detail, and analyzing why a little bit more. So one of the first reasons might be phenomenology. So when philosophers talk about phenomenology, thinking about how things seem from your first person perspective, what life seems like to you. So your phenomenology would be what it's like to be you. And you might think, well, I feel like I act freely, like if I pick up my phone, which is here, that seems like that was up to me. I have the sense in which I'm in control of that action. If I decide to say one word rather than the other, that seems like it's up to me. So when we make decisions or choices, we think, well, I could have made a different one. It seems like it's up to me. I could have made a different one. That's a really strong reason for thinking we have free will. And I think it's one of the most common reasons, is that it just seems part of our experience that we act freely. Like, I don't think everyone shares that view, but I think it's quite commonly held. And likewise, I think it's common to think, our decisions and choices originate within us. When I picked up my phone earlier as an example, I thought very quickly, what's an example, a very easy example of acting freely? How can I demonstrate a decision or choice that seems like it's up to me and I make that choice? That seems like a process that originated inside me. It didn't have some cause. It wasn't this book over here that did it, or it wasn't something in the past. It seemed like it was something that is up to me. I think we can really elaborate on this by thinking about major life choices, right? So I gather that everyone here chose to go to the University of Glasgow. Maybe some of you were forced, I hope not, but I think everyone here would have made a choice at some point on your UCAS application to go to the University of Glasgow. You thought, that's the best university, so I'm going to go here. Now, I presume that many of you think, and perhaps all of you think, you didn't have to make that choice. You didn't have to go to the University of Glasgow, even though it's the best university. You didn't have to go to the best. You could have gone to a different university. You could have gone to the University of Edinburgh, for example. It's good, but not quite as good. So you could have made that choice. It could have been up to you. It was freely open to you when on your UCAS application to put Edinburgh before Glasgow. But I gather you all thought, well, let's go to Glasgow. It's the best one. The important point is that this is a major life choice. How your life would have gone would have been quite different if you'd gone to the University of Edinburgh. For one thing, you wouldn't be in this lecture right now. You would be in a different lecture. Maybe you would have chosen different topics, and Edinburgh might give you different, even if you chose to do philosophy, at Edinburgh, they might give you different courses in your first and second year, and you might have had completely different things, a completely different education, and who you are now might have been very different based on that choice. And so that earlier choice to go to Glasgow over Edinburgh had some quite significant ramifications for where you are now, what you think, and the experiences that you've had or are currently having and will have in the future. And importantly, that life choice seems like it would have been up to you. You could have chosen otherwise. I think what's noticeable about this example is it really fits really nicely with the agency definition. I mean, this example is not about moral responsibility. It doesn't mention anything about your praiseworthiness or blameworthiness or your culpability for the choice. It's more about the experience, what you did, whether the choice originated within you or whether you could have done otherwise. Now, let's now turn to another reason to think you might have free will, and this is moral responsibility. So far we haven't talked about what moral responsibility is. Now, there's a lot we could say about what moral responsibility is. Philosophers can be quite idiosyncratic and a little bit annoying in what they define it as. So I'm going to stick today with quite a common definition. If you do further investigation into the nature of moral responsibility, you'll see that some people disagree with this. They'll think that it's something else, or there's more to it, or it's more basic or more complex. But at least the most common view is it's attached to praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. So to say that you're morally responsible for something means that you're either blameworthy or praiseworthy. So if you're morally responsible for doing something morally bad or morally wrong, you're blameworthy, and it's then appropriate for others to and yourself to blame you. Now, if you're morally responsible for something good, something exemplary, then you're praiseworthy, and yourself and others can praise you for what you do. Now, the idea that free will is a necessary condition on moral responsibility means that acting freely and of your own free will is a necessary condition on appropriate praise and blame. So if it turns out no one's ever acting freely, no one has free will, then all instances of praise and blame are inappropriate. We might still do them, but they're not appropriate. They shouldn't happen. They'd be mistaken. We'd all just be making these errors all the time. And your friend upsets you by making a cruel remark. Being upset or blaming that person for that would be an error. And when you help the old person cross the road and they say, oh, thank you so much, like I was struggling here, And I really appreciate you coming out your way to do this. Her gratitude, her praise of you at that time would be inappropriate as well, because what you did wasn't the result of your own free will. It was, because of causes in the long distant past. And, you happen to do it, but you're just, a pawn in this cosmic chess game. That is life. So why does free will matter? Well, free will matters because it underpins our moral responsibility practices. Praise and blame and other things like anger, resentment, indignation, gratitude, these kinds of emotional reactions, which can be considered forms of praise and blame, those all seem to rest on the fact that we have free will, or on the fact that we exercise free will in what we do. And so the idea here is that, free will might just be a necessary condition on moral responsibility. There might be more that's required to be morally responsible for what you do. But when we praise and blame ourselves and others, this is in part because we think they acted freely. And so our moral responsibility practices and our emotional reactions, those all depend on us having free will. Now let's consider this by looking at what we're going to call excuses and exemptions. We're going to talk a lot more about excuses and exemptions in the 5th lecture on Peter Strawson's paper, Freedom and Resentment. But for the moment, the way to think about this is that an excuse is just a sort of, when you excuse somebody, it could be because they didn't act freely. Whereas an exemption is going to be something a bit more long-term. So for example, it's quite common to excuse a person from blame and punishment if they didn't act freely. So consider the last thing somebody did wrong to you, right? Could be anything. A cruel remark, somebody might have, pickpocketed you, anything you like. We don't have to share these examples, just think about your own example. What was the last bad thing to happen to you? What was the last time that you were wronged? Now, suppose you found out that the person who wronged you had been coerced or manipulated into it. Perhaps their family had been kidnapped, and then, if they were told by the kidnappers, well, be mean to this person, otherwise, we're going to kill your family. There, it seems like they were kind of forced into it. They were coerced into being mean to you. That seems like a pretty good excuse for being mean to you. Now, you might think also about cases where people are manipulated. Suppose somebody had been, subject to some form of hypnosis. They'd gone to see a live show and they'd gone on the stage, and then the hypnotist had, worked their powers of hypnotism on the person. And as part of that, they were like, be mean to this person, be mean to them. They didn't realize they'd been victim to this kind of like post-hypnotic suggestion, and then they were mean to you as a result of that. That would also seem to excuse that person. Why does it do that? Well, because it seems in those instances, people aren't acting freely and of their own free will. They're acting in ways which are forced, coerced, or manipulated, and that seems like an excuse. So it seems clear that from that example, that acting freely is a necessary condition on moral responsibility, given that we'd excuse people when they don't, from blame and punishment when they didn't act freely. Now let's think more about exemptions. So exemptions are, it's a philosophical term of art to make the distinction between excuses and exemptions, but the idea of exemptions is a bit more long-term. There's something about that person's overall agency, their overall psychology, that means that they don't fully control their actions and are not fully responsible. So we might think about people who have really, really terrible upbringings. We're going to look more at this example in later lectures and also in the first collaborative class. But the case of Robert Harris is a real life case of, just to put it very briefly for our current purposes, he was a very, very nasty person. He was eventually sentenced to death and executed in the state of California. And the murders that he committed were especially cruel, like someone who seemed very, very heartless. But when you actually then learn about his upbringing and his circumstances, he had a very horrible home. He had a very abusive father. He was actually, his father didn't believe that he was his child, and he kicked the mother, Robert Harris's mother, in the stomach, and Robert Harris was born 3 months premature. Robert Harris was then subject to sort of verbal and physical abuse throughout his upbringing. At the age of 14, I think he was sent to juvenile prison. He was then subject to sexual abuse from the prisoners. And so throughout this entire horrible upbringing, he seemed to have been forged, turned into the horrible person he was, or at least that's one way of looking at his case. And I think it's often the case that, you know, even if we think someone's a vicious, horrible person who's blameworthy for what they do, once we learn about their terrible upbringing, that can affect what we think about them. At least that's one view of the situation. The important thing to note here is that when we think about excuses and exemptions and their connection with free will, this really fits with the moral responsibility definition. The fact that people don't act freely or seem to act less freely, and at least less freely in the case of Robert Harris, seems to make them less morally responsible. They seem like less appropriate targets of blame and less appropriate targets of punishment.